Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this event of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe at the University of Leuven. I am Albena Shkodrova, the coordinator of the forum and a historian. Our forum was established just over a year ago by the faculties of Arts and Social Sciences to foster academic and public conversation on this region and to communicate research, connecting it with important social challenges. And this is what we hope to achieve with this conversation tonight. Our topic is the notorious practice of denunciation, the practice of reporting neighbors, colleagues, or even strangers to authorities, which has been instrumentalized by many oppressive regimes in the 20th century. And now, with the rise of autocracy in Putin's Russia, the society there has witnessed the revival of this practice. And this happens only a few decades after, in the Soviet Union and throughout the Eastern European communist countries, denunciations were a key instrument to suppress political dissent and also to control upward social advancement in the society, making it dependent on political loyalties. Now, the revival of this practice in Russia today raises critical questions, and I think not only for Russians, but for all of us. How and why do individuals come to support dictatorships? Why do people, whether in private or public roles, cross what is from the perspective of liberal democracy ethical borders to align with oppressive powers? And also the pattern of what triggers these people, is it universal, or does it also contain some culturally or historically specific elements? And perhaps most importantly, can we draw lessons from the communist past, from the histories of denunciation in communist Europe, in contemporary Russia, and as a matter of fact, the histories of collaboration in the Western world during the Second World War with the Nazi occupiers? Can we draw lessons from these histories that might be useful for us to understand how resilient are our democracies today? Tonight we will explore these questions with two very knowledgeable on this matter speakers. Alexandra Arkhipova is one of them. She is a professor in social anthropology who studies the phenomenon of denunciation in contemporary Russia. What makes her particularly unique is that she is not only an academic who studies the phenomenon, but she has been a victim of denunciation. She was reported several times to authorities before she left the country. She was also labeled by Russian authorities a foreign agent, according to a law that was adopted at the beginning of the latest war in Ukraine. And this designation, which was given to Professor Arkhipova due to her collaboration with Western European universities, made it impossible for her to work in the country, so she was forced into exile, and now she works in France. She is currently a visiting professor at the École Normale Supérieure, and she continues to study the attitudes among Russians towards the war in Ukraine. In 2023, she curated No Wobble. This is the name of a virtual exhibition, still available online, which showcases around 500 pieces of street art with which citizens of Russia protest against the war in Ukraine. Also guest tonight is someone you might know very well. This is Professor Nico Wouters. He is the head of SEGESOMA, the division of the Belgian State Archives, which is also a study center on war and contemporary society. Nico Wouters is a guest professor at Ghent University, but what is perhaps the most relevant to our conversation tonight is that Professor Wouters has authored a monograph on collaboration among mayors and other public figures with the Nazi occupiers during the years of the Second World War. His research spans 3 countries with strong democratic traditions, namely Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, a very different context naturally compared to Russia or Eastern Europe, which makes our conversation tonight even more interesting because it will be possible to add a comparative perspective to the questions we're asking. And here I would like to extend my very warm welcome to our two guests tonight. Thank you so much for making time and coming all the way here to be with us tonight. Thank you. If you allow me, I would like to address my first question to Professor Arkhipova, because I am sure that now everybody in the room is very interested in your personal experience with denunciation. Would you please share with us what was this experience, what happened? Do you know who reported you and what was said about you and why did he do that? And also, how far did it affect you?
Hi to everybody. I'm really happy to be here for that famous denunciation. It was written to the president of my home former university in Russia and was signed by the name of Anna Koropkova, but it was a nickname, so nobody knew who she was. And she wrote that I committed immoral conduct, that I was talking to the journalist about war, how people react to the war, that basically is my main academic occupation. And this denunciation was very, 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 very long, and it was full of very strange phrases. And this person, Anna Koropkova, she's blaming me that I was accusing me of talking with people about the war, of mentioning the word war, of mentioning Facebook, which is Facebook is forbidden in Russia because it's an extremist organization, if you don't know it. But in this moment, I already left Russia, so it was not very dangerous for me. But if I would be in Moscow in that moment, so it can be dangerous. But very quick, I found out that this person, Anna Koropkova, she was snitching on all of my colleagues, which were trying to make any comments to the independent journalists about the war and so on. She was writing to the police about me and about them. She was writing to the directors of the institutions, universities, and so on. And she brought a lot of harm. So I decided to trace her. It took me 2 years to find who she is. Because she was using a very specific type of language and very specific cliché stereotypes, which we called formulas. Who are we? Well, I'm not like a real social anthropologist. Basically, my basic education is folklorist, so a specialist in folklore. And what is folklore? It's a stereotypic texts which people repeat, making some variations. So I collect a lot of denunciations signed by her. I compared them, I made a database, I found the stereotypic formulas which she used, and then I found out a big article in Wikipedia about this woman, Anna Koropkova, and this article in Wikipedia was written in using the same stereotypic language. So I decided that the person who wrote the article in Wikipedia about Anna Koropkova was Anna Koropkova. So then it took me and my colleagues a little bit more time. Then we found out who wrote this article. It was Ivana Baturov, journalist and historian from the Russian city Yekaterinburg. And he wrote more than 1,500 denunciations. Basically, these letters, these denunciations were made against people from the academic circles about their popular activity. So in the end, it took me 2 years, but I did find out who was Anna Koropkova. She was a real person, and I called this type of persons missionaire because they have a mission. They see us like enemies of the people. They want us out of the Russia. So his main idea is to find enemies, because Baturov, the real name of Anna Koropkova, Baturov wants people who do not support war to leave Russia immediately. So it's his mission to denounce them. And there are such people in Russia, there are plenty of them. It's one of the types of denunciations.
Right, and what you describe is kind of a mass denunciator, if I could call him like that. But apart from your personal experience, you do research the process. So you told me in our preliminary conversation that you made a classification of the motives which people might have. Would you share your findings?
Yes, of course. There are like two different types. If, for example, you and me, we are neighbors, and we know each other very well. We live in the same building, but there are some problems among us. For example, I make a lot of noise in the night time, and then if you call the police, they never come to your apartment because of some noise. But if you call the police and ask them that, well, this person, Sasha Arkhipova, is, I don't know, playing Ukrainian songs all the night, so this is the reason to police to come. So they use the people in Russia who want to punish their neighbors. They have a so-called emotional goal or material goal. They use the knowledge about repression as a weapon. But in this case, you and me, we know each other. And the goal is to punish the specific person whom you know, because you have some, practical, emotional or material goal. And the other case, as in the case of Anna Karapkova, when you don't know persons whom you are denouncing, you just have a moral goal. You just want to find these enemies and to send them away. It's just you are on mission. So there are two different types. The first type was quite popular, in every time and everywhere, in every country, and in Western Europe too. So it's not only specifically totalitarian regimes, no. But the second type, when these people, they start to make these political denunciations because they think that it's their moral mission, this is interesting because this is a shape of current political regime.
Right. In my own research on Bulgaria in the long 50s, I observed how initial spontaneous denunciations, which could be attributed to post-war retribution perhaps, were gradually taken on as administrative tool by the state to control social mobility. And this was done through the means of характеристики. These were documents which replaced usual CVs. It was your employer who had to compose in the 50s a характеристика for you. And it was a document which described your political correctness to the regime, your background, extended family's background. So it went far beyond your personal performance in your lifetime. And these were labels for lifetime because no information from these characteristics was ever erased. It followed you all your life. But what is the most, I think, startling there is how the information for this characteristic was collected. And it was exactly, I think, with the means of modified denunciations, because what happened was that the employers did not have information on their employees at all times. So they were obliged to write this characteristic in the 50s. And to do so, they started writing letters to the native villages of their employees. And these letters were usually addressed to some sort of party activist, social activist, anybody who would be with a political profile that would fit in the interests of the Communist Party. And these people did not always know about the person. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. So they collected in their own ways information through their network. They wrote to the schools where the people were. But the kind of information that came back, and which was the basis of this characteristic, was very clearly unchecked. It was from very vague sources. Somebody said, rumors. Everything that goes into denunciation could find its way back then in this characteristic. So this was a system which supported on grassroots level, holding at bay any social advance of any individual in the society, depending on his political loyalty or hers. So I was wondering, do you see anything like this happening again now? Because it was by far not isolated to in Bulgaria phenomenon, right? The same was happening probably across Eastern European countries and in the Soviet Union. Do you see it today happening again? Is it being taken over by the state to be used?
No, basically there was very familiar practice back in the Soviet times, but not now. What we have now, it's like the public persons who they love for now deputies, political elites, some just public figures. They love to denounce people. They love to report people, and they do it in that form. A public post in Telegram or Vkontakte, which is Russian national social media, for example, like that. The investigation committee should pay attention what this terrible Russian bard poet is singing or talking. So basically this person, the public figure, is talking to his audience, but he's saying that the investigation committee, it's a part of police, very dangerous one. They should pay attention to that person. So this is basically a public denunciation. It's happening now everywhere.
Right, but it still hasn't spread into some sort of an act with administrative consequences, which is nationwide. No. And if I may now ask you, Professor Wouters, do you recognize any of what you heard here? You did your research in 3 countries with very strong democratic traditions, and the context is certainly very different, yet it might be that some part of it is universal or not.
Yes, indeed. I think part of it is universal, so I can be perhaps very brief in my answer, because I can more or less perhaps confirm what you've just said from my own work on the Second World War and what I know about the First World War, so occupied Belgium and parts of France as well. What I've learned from that was indeed that denouncing other people is a form of intricate social relationships between people that is universal, that happens now, today, in democracies as well. It happens today on social media, so it's a normal, universal social mechanism that I think always has to do with social status. It has to do with social mobility. It has to do with one person denouncing another person in order to improve his or her position by making a contrast with that other person. So it always has to do with social status, I think. So I think it is a universal mechanism. The only difference, of course, is that in repressive dictatorships, that social mechanism is weaponized and institutionalized, and it becomes part of a repressive machine. And that is, of course, the big difference. And indeed, in the occupied countries during the world wars, the patterns are very recognizable, indeed. There are many types of ways how a dictatorship can organize. It can be very top-down and institutionalized. It can also be very bottom-up and almost self-mobilizing. People can be engaged in doing that. So there are different types, I think, of repressive institutions in terms of denouncing. But to answer very briefly to your question, it's very recognizable. We can get into that, but it's I think it's a universal practice, yes.
And if you compare, for example, the 3 countries which you studied, is there anything that was specific for any of them?
Yes, a lot. Perhaps I will go more into the similarities, if that's also permitted that way to answer your question, because there are obviously a lot of differences. You have 3 countries, even the occupation regime itself is very different. So there are a lot of differences. But I also think there are some similarities, and one similarity in particular that I think has a lot of an importance for today. And that's why I want to focus on that, because if you look at the traction that a dictatorship has, it's, I think, a very interesting, almost something of an experiment to look at 1940, because you have 3, like you mentioned, 3 countries, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, with very deeply rooted democratic institutions, very deeply rooted institutional memories also of democracy, very strong constitutional frameworks. So 3 countries that in principle, in theory, should be very resilient towards, let's say, dictatorial pressure. So it's very interesting test to see what happens when these 3 countries, theoretically very resilient, when they are confronted with a dictatorship overnight. And the answer to that question is they did not cope very well. They did quite poorly, as a matter of fact. And I think that's a lesson that we've kind of forgotten about the Second World War, because a lot of our collective memory nowadays of the Second World War is, I think, more focused on the second part, the second half of the Second World War, so 1943, 1944, a period where there was a lot of resistance, for example, here in Belgium, in Flanders now. The last few years, there's a lot of attention on the resistance during the Second World War, quite rightly so. But I think we've kind of forgotten what happened in the first years of the occupation, 1940-41, and what happened was that not just collaborators who were, quite frankly, a marginal portion of society. In the Netherlands and Belgium, they were less than 1% of the population. So we're talking about a marginal fraction of the population. But I'm talking about a larger representative sample of the population, and especially also the institutes, civil servants, politicians, magistrates, the police, the financial economic elites in all three countries in 1940 decided to abandon democracy. In France, this is obviously the most striking example. It were not the Germans who abolished democracy in France. It was the French themselves. It was the French Parliament who abolished the Third Republic and installed the authoritarian new state with a new head of state, etc. So the so-called Vichy regime that engaged in state collaboration with the German occupier, and also governed its own free zone in the south for 2 years. So it was the French who abolished democracy themselves, and in Belgium and in the Netherlands, similar mechanisms were quite visible as well. In Belgium, there was a large attempt to create a new authoritarian Belgian regime under King Leopold III, as a new authoritarian ruler. And this was, like I said, this was not just a small marginal portion of the extreme right wing of Belgium. This was quite large representative sample that was engaged in this attempt. In the Netherlands, there was a lot less political space for this kind of political maneuvering. But I just want to quote one example. There was this broader Dutch organization, the Dutch Union, the Nederlandse Unie, which gained more than 850,000 members. So this was a very bottom-up movement in 1940 from Dutch society itself, with a very vague, but nevertheless a very clear as well, attempt also to abolish parliamentary democracy, to abolish elections, to abolish different political parties, to create some kind of a corporatist, unified society. So this, in 1914, that's kind of a lesson we have forgotten, that we came actually quite close to abolish democracy ourselves. And this is, I think, an important lesson for today, because I think it has some similarities with today. Perhaps we can talk about this later in the debate, in the discussion, but I think that is a lesson that we kind of have forgotten, and I think it has a lot of relevance for today still.
Right. I suppose not everyone in this room knows your work, and you have these very interesting insights on how mayors in particular were reasoning when betraying what we would consider to say reasonable democratic behavior. Could you elaborate on what was the process? Because it was quite different compared to individuals, of course, right? If you are in a public position that put you elsewhere.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the word betrayal, but they would not have considered it a betrayal. On the contrary, they would have considered it as their duty, even their patriotic duty towards their country, towards their population. Of course, there was a foreign repressive occupation regime, so we should not forget about that. But nevertheless, it was a fact that a lot of people within the elites took the occupation as an opportunity to install a regime which in their eyes was more organic, was more efficient, was better equipped to deal with the many problems that were facing society at that point. And it was not considered a betrayal, on the contrary. I think one of the main things you have to keep in mind is the prehistory of the 1930s. The year 1940 as a moment of rupture does not fall from the sky. It is the consequence of what happens in the 1930s. And I think it is an important factor to keep in mind that the general feeling in the 1930s, and it all culminates in 1940, of course, that parliamentary democracy, liberal democracy, is obsolete. It is an old system. It is not a system that is capable of dealing with modern, current-day economic, for example, issues anymore. Authoritarian regimes were considered in the 1930s and in 1940 at that culmination point as the new modern answers to current day problems at that time. And that is something that is, I think, essential to understand why these authoritarian ideas gained so much traction at the end of the 1930s and in 1940 as well. And again, I think therein lies a big similarity or a big danger or a big warning from history, if you want to use that term, for today, actually.
Right, that's a question I wanted to ask both of you. Seeing what is happening today in the developed world and unimaginable until recently events are unfolding, one of the hopes expressed by, for example, historians is that our future depends on the resilience of the democratic institutions. And I'm quoting here, for example, Timothy Snyder, but I'm sure many others have hold the same opinion. What is your take on that as a historian? In what state do you see the democratic institutions in Belgium, in the Netherlands, or in France today to be?
There's also always this big debate right now about, are we reliving the 1930s, so to speak? Are we back in the 1930s? This is like a cliche that comes up from time to time. I do not think that the 1930s are back. I think there are much more differences between now and the 1930s. The differences outweigh the similarities, and indeed our democratic resilience in terms of an international body of rules, in terms of human rights, for example, the checks and balances, the European Union has, many international institutions that did not exist in the 1930s. We are much more resilient and much stronger than we were back then. The problem is that the danger will not be the same as then. So I'm personally not afraid that the fascists will take over power in Belgium anytime soon. But I do think that another type, an Orban-like figure, could gain a lot of traction in Western Europe as well. And then I come to the one big similarity that what I was talking about is the loss of legitimacy of the parliamentary democracy as a system of governing. That is a big similarity that I see with the 1930s, and that's the one thing that really, or there are a lot of things that worry me, but that's one of the things that really worries me, especially among younger people. You can define democracy obviously in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways to look at democracy is that it is simply a system of governance. It is a way of organizing your society, like there are also other types of ways of organizing your society. And when at a certain point enough people in society, enough segments in society lose faith in the fact that parliamentary democracy is the best way to defend their interests, democracy can very quickly lose its social legitimacy and support. And I just recently, just 2 days ago, I think, I read in the newspapers, there was a survey in Great Britain, I think, that over half of the young men between 25 and 40 think that a strong leader and an autocratic leader would be better suited to deal with the problems in Great Britain than the current system, parliamentary democracy. More than half. So I that's quite a scary figure. That's just one figure, and I don't know what the numbers for Belgium are, but I can only hope that they are much lower. But nevertheless, we know the voting behavior of younger people, especially males. I think we can safely say that there is among younger people more and more tolerance, as also the collective memory of the Second World War is disappearing right now. There's a much higher tolerance for an authoritarian option, I think. And that really worries me, because that's a big parallel with the 1930s. This idea that democracy is weak, is slow, is inefficient, takes too much time to come up with real solution is all this rhetoric, and that authoritarian regimes are strong, efficient, or better suited for modern problems. I have the idea that a lot of younger people tend to support these kinds of ideas. That's a big similarity with the 1930s, and that's something that really worries me. Sorry, that's a long answer.
No, it was a very eloquent one. Thank you. Alexandra, would you like to add your...
Shortly, I would like to say that, I not completely agree that this problem of denunciation, it's only problem for the Western Europe and for Russia now. I think no. Because do you remember 3 years ago, COVID time? There was a huge wave of denunciations. People denounced each other. Oh, these neighbors, they don't want to be in lockdown. They secretly go out in the nighttime. The police stations were full of such denunciations. There are book published in France just now about this, and I don't know, about 5 academic papers. So, and it was considered like to be a huge problem back in France, because like normal citizens, they denounced each other because they feel this urge to do it, because they feel the danger, and they have an instrument to do it. So they were denouncing it all. So it was a big challenge for, at least for the French institutions during the COVID time. So it was happening everywhere. But we survived COVID.
Yes, I think Professor Wouters is right in what he says, that the denunciation as such, neighbor, snitching on your neighbor, is a fact of life at all times, all over the world. But of course the difference is how this is instrumentalized and how far the state is involved in this instrumentalization and how is it being used. Right,
Yeah,
and there come the differences.
Because to be sure, I didn't say that it was. I just said
Right,
the opposite.
yeah.
In fact, that it was universal.
Yes.
So that it was.
But may I go back to the issue of denunciation with my last question? I would like to ask you a bit about social media, because if you think of it, social media function a bit seems a bit like a strong instrument for denunciation. They tend to amplify anonymous voices, maliciousness, they popularize untruths, so they function actually as like a digitalized instrument for denunciation. Of course, in the democratic context, this is nothing but public shaming. It doesn't have consequences beyond that. But what if we imagine these social media functioning in autocratic regimes? What are your thoughts? Do they present a real potential instrument, a threat?
Again, a lot of repressive mechanisms which now are using back in Russia, they were invented, or at least were used, during the first and the second year of COVID-19. So, for example, during that period, Russian government, they start to produce a lot of digital resources, like, for example, you use Telegram. The investigation committee says, oh, please send us what you think. It's anonymous, you can send whatever you want, specifically pay attention to people who doesn't want to be in lockdown or say something about the government. And so on and so on and so on. So every Russian big political institution start to have its own channel to communicate with people. So it became very easy to complain. And very easy. You can complain about the school of your children, that you don't like the children, or the textbooks are bad. Or you could complain about your neighbors and that they're listening to Ukrainian songs in the nighttime. So all this way became absolutely possible. They start to check this system during the COVID-19. They start to create a lot of digital resources to do it. And now, 2 years later, they start to use it to track anti-war activity. A lot. So yes. The answer is yes.
Would you like to?
But my answer is also yes. I think everybody here in this room is well aware of the potential and the risks and the dangers of social media, not so much perhaps of denunciations, but certainly in terms of controlling minds and opinions of people, controlling information. And I mean, Nazi Germany was one of the first. It was a very modern regime in many senses. It was one of the very first, if I can use that word, totalitarian regimes to recognize the importance of modern tools, modern new instruments at that time for propaganda uses. So in that time it was radio and film, for example, not so much television, but cinema. So the radio was a very important tool for Hitler to have a radio in each household, to really address each household in Germany. So propaganda was obviously an extremely important instrument for Nazi Germany, and I think Hitler could have only dreamed of the instruments that are available right now on social media. I'm not a big social media expert, but a small change in an algorithm, you can decide exactly what kind of information certain segments of the population get or don't get. So that's extremely worrying, and it poses an extreme challenge, I think, to which Western society has not really yet come up with an adequate answer. It's a very complex discussion about different democratic rights that are opposed within that. I mean, freedom of speech, obviously, but there are different rights that are opposed against each other. and it's really a weighing of which right prevails on the other. It's, like I said, a challenge to which democracies have not yet formed a good answer to. But obviously the answer is yes. It's one of the big challenges of the next 10 years, I think, of how to manage social media.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's a good way to conclude our conversation, even if in a bit of a dark mode, but I guess the entire conversation went in this note.